And I wish on a rainy day, which is of course good for California, that the news I could bring would be more positive. Just to kind of frame these brief comments, I will place the slides on the website. I'll show you the website in a second. And perhaps the most endangered aspect of this chart may be the last line there, the science envoy for the State Department, because as some of you may know, but others may not have seen yet, as bad as the EPA news was for thinking about engaging positively at the federal level, the not fully formed, but looks like 90% done announcement of Rex Tillerson, the CEO of ExxonMobil, as the Secretary of State. In my capacity as an individual, not representing any institution on the page, probably brings the appointments being considered so far to an absolute new low. And so I don't think there's much positive to say about what we're seeing out of DC. And so what I'm going to try to do to lighten that a little bit is to look at the kind of comments that you opened with. What can we really do in this environment? And to what degree are the things that are happening that are positive ones that a misinformed or misguided individual or a small group of individuals hopefully cannot undo too much. And so the website at the top, I'll post the slides this evening. So if any of you want to get them from the website. And while the Twitter feed is not my vacation pictures, it's meant to be kind of one or so posts a day about what our laboratory is doing. And I really want to just begin with a kind of just a 3-minute where have we come in the last few years. So I was at the World Bank, not the most liberal of institutions 6 years ago, but the report that was commissioned by the World Bank, ironically under Bob Zoellick, the former head, was to really highlight that the path that we were on globally, 4 degrees or more, you often hear 5 or 6, but 4 degrees or more of global warming was a world that we must avoid at all costs. It didn't really see there was a lot of routes to get there, given that the inertia and momentum in our fossil fuel system is so large. So slow-moving, the supertanker analogy certainly comes to mind and comes back into mind with Rex Tillerson. But a number of individual events really led to the hopefulness that is Paris, and I'd like to think carried on to Marrakesh at least until the 9th. And that is really that the 2 slowest moving major players in the climate process, the 2 countries that accounted for 40% of global energy use, 40% of global emissions, stepped out of a very, very slow moving, but positive, but way too slow moving process and essentially signed a, if you will, a G2 of climate agreement. And the US and China in 2014 at the APEC summit essentially said, we are not going to negotiate with everyone else. We're going to come up with a 2-party deal, a very unconventional deal that my political science friends don't really quite know how it fits together because the US and China agreed to act. They didn't agree to act in the same time scale with the same objectives. They just agreed to act. It was a very unusual kind of deal, but it literally led directly to the kind of huge euphoria, but without any details, that we saw in Paris. And the Paris Accord is monumental in a whole variety of features. What it did essentially was to establish the critical target of 2 degrees or less of warming. That's half that, the number in the chart I just showed before, this 4 degrees or less sort of feature. But essentially said this is a big, all-inclusive tent where each country can pick what it wants to work on more. Clean energy, rights for women, water issues, and figure out what's the climate benefits of those actions, and then quantify them. And I'll come back to that critical big tent aspect that the US appears to be stepping away from in just a couple minutes. I will not do the technical details, but just kind of highlight, hopefully everyone has seen a version of these graphs showing global temperature rise, sea level rise, and then snow cover in the northern hemisphere. And the series of climate meetings and announcements by the group of several thousand scientists, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was essentially to highlight where we were in 1990, 1995, 2000, etc. And I'm just going to jump to the 4th assessment report, which is the first time this group, which was given a very limited mandate, a mandate to assess the science not really to comment on it, but this group on which I'm a part of, has worked and twisted within that to try to say the most progressive or policy recommendations they could under this mandate that their job was not to set policy in order to recommend it, but to assess where we are. And it's this last sentence that I think really moved the IPCC along in a critical way. Of course, the IPCC shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize with Al Gore. And this was this line that, based on this scientific assessment that was then passed through and not watered down more than you see here by the 194 member countries, that climate change is in fact the ultimate negative externality, that it will affect the world's poor worldwide most immediately and most strongly. And that doesn't mean the poor in Nicaragua or Burkina Faso, it means the poor everywhere, from people living in tents and underpasses in Oakland as homeless, to kind of the classic third world development kind of poverty. And that's really the critical statement of where we were. And when you add up that path that we were on, 4 or more degrees of warming, to the set of commitments that countries made in a very unconstrained way, but a very positive way for Paris, that's the black line. So that red above the black line are the commitments to reducing emissions that all of the countries said they would do. No verification, no details, none of the nitty-gritty, if you will. If Paris is the city of light and of love, perhaps what happened in Paris was there was an engagement with climate, but there was no marriage. And what has to happen next is not only to make all those agreements real, but then to recognize that that only gets us to about 3.5 degrees. And we know we need to get to 2 degrees or less. I won't get into scientific details about the numbers there, but that's the path. So 40% or so of what we need to do, committed to in a totally soft way, but a recognition we have to go deeper. And the footnote for the experts is that actually the United States signed on with many of the world's developing nations and said, no, 2 degrees is our legal target, but we are part of what's wonderfully called the High Ambition Coalition, to hit target of 1.5 degrees, far more like what we need to get to preserve local human rights, to preserve local watersheds, agricultural resources, etc. And we were on a relatively positive pathway. At a very important meeting in Kigali in October, a US-led effort to reduce the emissions from CFCs and HCFCs still further actually estimated to cut about another 0.5 degree off. And those Kigali Accords, the last major activity signed by Secretary of State Kerry, really highlighted that while not guaranteeing we can get all these things done, that what was on the table was really starting to look like a wonderful coalition of actions, bringing those numbers down, and of course all the proof is in the pudding about what's going to go on in terms of making good on them. That's what the Marrakesh meeting, next year's meeting in Bonn, etc., will need to work for. The critical human rights element that was vaguely on the table before Paris, but critically on the table after Paris, was to recognize that it's not just about total amount of clean energy. It's that some 1.3 or 4 billion people around the world don't have access to even basic forms of energy. So the pie chart for each region of the world shows the number of people in millions in rural areas and urban areas, the big part of the pie being rural, the small part being urban, in the major regions of the world who don't have access today. That's the pie chart on the left. The pie chart on the right is the expected number to be without energy access in 2030 based on our current trajectory. So this is an admission of a failure of the development enterprise, of the ability to bring energy in its large grid-based forms, in its off-grid, mini-grid, decentralized forms to people around the planet who critically need it. And we know in details that I won't go into today that when you look at these numbers in detail, that all kinds of quality of life indicators get better with energy access. And lots of details, and I won't do the details here, but gender parity in education, access to sanitation, all kinds of things
show a correlation, not necessarily a causation, but a correlation with more and better energy services. And each of these lines with lots of scatter points, each data point's a different country, show that we do see some real important changes in quality of life, access, so democratic opportunities as countries progress. The other side of the story is that G2 process that we saw US and China and a number of other places around the world, Denmark, Japan, Korea, Kenya, Madagascar, Bangladesh, all leaders in thinking about clean energy for their people were doing, was really spreading. California, we like to think that we're really on the cutting edge, and we are definitely on the cutting edge. But an important announcement by the host of the climate conference, Morocco, is that their goal for 2030 is 52%. 2% better than California's goal in terms of the percentage of energy to come from renewables. So when a place like Morocco jumps to the front of the queue in terms of being a clean energy leader, all of these issues about clean energy for the climate, but also energy access. Morocco has over 98% on-grid electricity access, even in remote villages. This is a really remarkable picture. And then, if we look at what used to be the kind of opposition to clean energy, and I don't mean Texas or Trump Tower, what I mean is the parts of the world that are not seen as being on this agenda. This is an announcement by the Minister of the leader of electricity ministry in Dubai, announcing that they have launched a solar energy project at 3 cents per kilowatt hour. That's a number so far below what we're talking about that, MC Hammer in the Bay Area is right, you can't touch this. No fossil fuel, no large hydro, no nuclear, no project can come close to a price tag for solar power. And when it was first announced that they had accepted a bid at 2.99 cents per kilowatt hour, there was some skepticism until another project, another round of bids was announced in Abu Dhabi next door at 2.54 cents. That doesn't mean every solar project is at that price, but what it means is that if you do it right, clean energy can literally trump all these other sorts of options. And it's a remarkable perspective on how much the technical, the economic base of clean energy has changed. And if we look at home, the litany of projects, largest thin film project, largest photovoltaic project, largest solar thermal project. It's just an ongoing legacy of projects at large scale, but also at very small scale that have all come into play. And if there's anything hopeful to say in this grim time with these Trump appointments coming out, it's that if the kind of activism that we heard in the opening really takes place, the economic and technical basis to transition is something that I would like to think that a small group of misguided individuals may be able to damage in the short term, but are not going to derail. But that's going to depend on a level of coordination in the US, understanding the areas in which we failed to outreach properly to parts of the US that didn't get carried in the kind of economic upsurge that not all of, but some of California highlights. This use of clean energy at the large scale I showed, but this is one of my grad students who's now Director of Energy Access at Facebook, Dmitry Gershenson, looking at a market where all these kinds of distributed projects are being sold. It's a remarkable story of bringing energy services much more rapidly, more cleanly, and more democratically than we've seen before. A last piece of the story is that this is one of the reasons why these appointments we're seeing at EPA and at state are so disappointing, is that we're only beginning to really tap the wide range of benefits. One of the things that has been leaked in a Trump team document is a full-scale attack on the so-called endangerment finding from the Supreme Court that carbon dioxide is a pollutant to be managed. And if you undo that, many of the actions that many of us were hoping will be robust against Trump because they're part of settled law in the country come up for grabs. And of course that brings something we won't talk about too much today, the Supreme Court issue. But This set of findings about CO2 as a pollutant, settled science, but evidently not settled policy in the Trump quarters, highlights the last part of the story for me, and that is that we're only learning now just how large are the benefits in terms of human rights of clean energy. And I highlight this with the last picture, and that is when we look at international aid, not just from the US, which is now certainly under threat, but from other countries, an incredibly small fraction of that goes to the most impacted individuals, refugees, communities that are displaced either internally or regionally. And yet clean energy is one of the fastest ways to bring services to those communities. So as we speak today, I have 2 students in a relief camp on the border of Sudan and South Sudan, talking about deploying items like this. Self-contained energy storage, Wi-Fi production, water purification with essentially fold-out solar roofs. And one of the huge areas where clean energy literally trumps the alternatives is how quickly you can put these types of technologies into place. This is a picture from South Sudan. The first store to go into the town where my students were is this one with solar out front. There is a development funded by USAID money, and if you look carefully, you will see no wires, no piping, no nothing between the homes because of this use of distributed clean energy to quickly build infrastructure which is far more resilient to many of the crises we see. And so I'll end there and just open up for questions and comments. But it highlights how much of the upside of clean energy we are only beginning to explore. And after, I would say, a President Obama first term that had a few successes but was halting, but a second term that was an absolute home run in terms of bringing these stories together, now we unfortunately face this challenge to absolutely figure out a way to continue these types of efforts that promote long-term climate justice, short-term human rights, in an era where we are seeing a series of at least proposed appointments at the federal level that take the US so far out of the mainstream that not only is President Putin delighted, because of course Rex Tillerson has received several awards from Putin as a friend of Russia, something you can look at afterwards, but China literally is saying every miscue by the United States is more economic opportunity for us. So we are at a very challenged moment, and thank you for letting me speak briefly, and then for some Q&A.